I've always been a night owl. The silence, the lack of distractions. It's when I feel most alive. So, when I bought my new house on the outskirts of town, the idea of those wide-open nights with no neighbors to disturb me was thrilling. The realtor had gushed about the privacy, the unmatched tranquility, and I was sold. I moved in on a Friday. By Saturday night, I began to understand why the previous owners might have been so eager to sell. The first sign was subtle, almost laughable in hindsight. I'd just finished setting up my desk in the study. It was late, close to midnight, and the house was wrapped in a blanket of stillness. I was unpacking the last box of books when I heard it. A soft creak, like weight shifting on an old floorboard. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but the sound came again, closer this time. I froze, the spine of a book still in my hand, and strained my ears. Nothing, just my own shallow breathing. I chuckled, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, and went back to work. But that was when I noticed it. My reflection in the darkened window above the desk. It wasn't just me. Behind my shoulder, in the faint moonlight spilling in through the blinds, there was a shape. Tall, human. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed a little too dark, every creak a little too deliberate. The house was old, built in the 1930s according to the realtor, but the sounds weren't just random. They had rhythm, a pattern like footsteps. Sunday night was worse. I'd been working late again, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere, when I decided to go downstairs for some tea. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard it. A faint humming, melodic and haunting. It was coming from the kitchen. My blood ran cold. I hadn't turned on the radio or TV. Gripping a heavy paperweight from my desk, I crept down the stairs. The humming grew louder, each note sending a chill up my spine. I rounded the corner into the kitchen, ready to confront whoever or whatever was there. The room was empty, but the sound persisted. I realized it was coming from the vents, a soft, eerie tune echoing through the ductwork. I slammed the vent cover shut, but the humming continued, fainter now, as if retreating deeper into the house. By Wednesday, I was no longer sleeping. The nights were filled with whispers, barely audible but unmistakably there. They came from the walls, the ceiling, the floors. I'd walk into a room, and the murmurs would abruptly stop, like a conversation had been cut short. I began to notice things moving. A chair slightly out of place, a door I was sure I'd closed now ajar. I started leaving sticky notes around the house, marking positions of furniture, checking locks, trying to catch the house in the act. The proof came Thursday night. I'd set up a camera in the living room, aimed at the couch where I'd often find cushions displaced. Around 3 a.m., I reviewed the footage. My breath hitched. The video showed the room, bathed in the bluish glow of the security light outside. For hours, nothing happened. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the cushions shifted, slowly, deliberately. No one was there. I watched, paralyzed, as the coffee table inched forward, then stopped. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, coalescing into a shape at the edge of the frame. The video ended abruptly, the screen cutting to static. That night, I decided to leave. I grabbed a bag, threw in essentials, and headed for the door. But when I reached the front hallway, I froze. The walls were breathing. The plaster seemed to expand and contract, a low, guttural sound accompanying each inhale and exhale. My legs felt like lead. The door in front of me slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking audibly into place. And then I heard it. A voice, deep and resonant, echoing from every corner of the house. "Stay!" I ran. Not for the front door, but for the basement. It was the only place left, the one area of the house I hadn't explored yet. My rational mind screamed at me to stop. What kind of idiot runs deeper into the house in a horror scenario? But something compelled me. The basement was worse than I imagined. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the scent of mildew. The walls were lined with shelves of jars, strange, unlabeled things floating in murky liquid. At the far end of the room stood an old boiler, its surface pockmarked with rust. The humming was louder here. I approached the boiler, every instinct telling me to turn back. As I got closer, I saw the truth. The humming wasn't coming from the boiler. It was coming from behind it. With trembling hands, I pushed the rusted behemoth aside, revealing a narrow door. It opened on its own. Inside was a small room, its walls covered in strange symbols carved deep into the stone. In the center, a mirror, but not just any mirror. The reflection wasn't mine. It took everything I had to pull myself away from that room. By the time I made it back upstairs, the house was silent, oppressively so. I left that night, abandoning everything I owned. The house still stands, a dark silhouette at the edge of town. Sometimes I think about going back, to confront whatever it was, to prove to myself it wasn't real. But I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes. They're waiting. I didn't sleep for days after leaving the house. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mirror, the symbols, and the thing that had stared back at me. It wasn't my reflection, not really. It had my face, but its eyes were empty, soulless. It had smiled, and then it had moved. I stayed at a motel on the edge of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and peeling wallpaper. I figured the anonymity would make me feel safe, but the paranoia clung to me like a second skin. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn. Every creak of the building made me jump. But it didn't stop there. The first night, I woke to the sound of knocking. First, I thought it was the door. 3 sharp raps. I got up, heart racing, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. Then I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, holding my breath. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faint and muffled, I heard it. Whispers. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. All overlapping, hissing, and murmuring words I couldn't make out. The same words I'd heard in the house. I didn't sleep that night. By the second night, I was convinced it had followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like something unseen was pressing down on me. I started seeing shadows move in the corners of my vision. When I turned to look, nothing was there. At 3:33 a.m., my phone buzzed. I shouldn't have answered. I knew that even as I picked it up, the screen glowing in the darkness. The number was blocked. Against my better judgment, I swiped to answer. Hello. My voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was only static. Then the voice came through, low, distorted, and familiar. Come back. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. The call ended on its own, the screen returning to the lock screen. But before it did, I saw something reflected in the blackness of the screen. A face. My face. But it wasn't me. The next day, I decided to go back to the house. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop until I did. I spent the drive trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining things. Stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even carbon monoxide poisoning back in the house. There had to be a rational explanation. But when I pulled into the driveway, all my rationalizations crumbled. The house looked different. The shutters hung crooked. The windows were dark and lifeless. The grass in the front yard had withered to a sickly yellow. It looked abandoned, like it had been sitting vacant for years. But I'd left just 3 days ago. The door was unlocked. It swung open with a creak, revealing the dim interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, like blood. I stepped inside. The house was wrong. The layout hadn't changed, but the dimensions felt off. The ceilings were too high, the hallways too narrow. Shadows clung to the corners, defying the light spilling in from the windows. And the whispers, oh, the whispers. They were everywhere now, louder than before, echoing from every surface. I made my way to the basement, my steps echoing unnaturally. The walls seemed to pulse as I passed, the plaster rippling like water. When I reached the door to the basement, it was already open. The narrow stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step taking me closer to the source of the humming. The boiler was still there, rusted and foreboding. And behind it, the door. It was different now. The symbols carved into the stone walls around it glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the humming. The air was colder here, each breath visible in the dim light. I stepped into the room. The mirror was waiting. It wasn't just a mirror. Couldn't have been. The reflection it showed wasn't the room behind me. It was something else entirely. A vast, empty void filled with swirling shadows. And in the center of it stood me, or the thing wearing my face. It stared at me with those empty eyes, the corners of its mouth twitching into a grin. When it spoke, its voice was mine, but distorted, echoing like it came from deep underwater. "You shouldn't have left," it said. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the spot, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. The thing in the mirror stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. The surface rippled like water. Then it started to push through. Panic overtook me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hand found a piece of broken wood on the floor, part of an old shelf, maybe, and I gripped it like a lifeline. As the thing's arm breached the surface of the mirror, I swung with all my strength. The mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 panes of glass breaking at once. The shards flew outward, cutting into my skin. The thing let out a scream, high-pitched and unnatural, as the void behind the mirror collapsed in on itself. And then silence. I don't know how I made it out of the house. The next thing I remember, I was in my car, speeding down the highway, blood seeping from the cuts on my arms and face. I never looked back. The house has been boarded up since then. I drive past it sometimes against my better judgment. It's still there, dark and lifeless, a scar on the landscape. But I know it's not over. Sometimes when I look in the mirror I see it, the thing with my face, watching, waiting. I don't think it's done with me yet. They say time heals all wounds. But they don't tell you what to do when time itself feels warped, stretched thin by the weight of something unnatural. It's been months since I left that house, since I shattered that mirror. Months since I thought I'd escaped. But I was wrong. Started small, just little things. My reflection lingering a second too long when I looked away. Shadows moving where they shouldn't. Whispers in the dead of night, faint but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the signs grew louder, clearer, until there was no denying it. I hadn't left the house behind. It had followed me. The first real incident happened 2 weeks ago. I was at a gas station, filling up my car. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the night air cool against my skin. I glanced up at the station's window to check my reflection, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't me. The figure in the glass was staring at me, but its face was wrong. The eyes were hollow, black voids, and its grin was impossibly wide, stretching across its face like a wound. It raised a hand and waved. I dropped the pump and backed away, heart hammering in my chest. When I looked back, the reflection was normal, just me, pale and shaken. But I knew what I'd seen. After that, the events escalated. At night, my dreams were no longer my own. I'd wake up in cold sweats, my mind filled with images of the mirror, the void, and the thing inside it. One night, I dreamt I was back in the house, standing in the basement. The shattered mirror was whole again, its surface pristine and gleaming. I saw myself in it, but it wasn't me. It was the thing. It smiled, reached out, and grabbed my wrist, yanking me toward the glass. I woke up gasping, clutching my wrist. There, on my skin, was a faint, hand-shaped bruise. The breaking point came last night. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with a movie. The lights were on, the doors locked, every precaution taken. I even had a baseball bat within arm's reach, just in case. But it didn't matter. Around midnight, the TV started flickering. Static crackled across the screen, the audio cutting in and out. I grabbed the remote, fumbling to turn it off, but the power button did nothing. And then the static stopped. The screen showed the mirror room, My heart stopped. The image was live, the camera angle shifting slightly, as if someone or something was holding it. The mirror stood in the center of the frame, its surface dark and rippling like liquid. Then it showed me. I was sitting in my living room exactly as I was now. The camera zoomed in, focusing on my face, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows behind me. I turned, my hands shaking, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the thing was there, standing behind me, its hollow eyes boring into mine. And then the power went out. The darkness was absolute, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I grabbed the baseball bat and edged toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming to get out. That's when I heard it. The whispers. They were coming from every direction, overlapping and chaotic, filling the room like a tidal wave. I couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. They wanted me to stay. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence. Something massive and malevolent, closing in. My breath came in ragged gasps, the bat trembling in my hands. Then, a voice. Low, distorted, and familiar. You can't run. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in the middle of the street. The bat was gone, and my hands were covered in cuts. The blood dried and crusted. The house was gone. Not the new house, but my house. The one I'd run to for safety. Where it had stood was now an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Was I losing it? Had I imagined everything? And then I saw the mirror. It was leaning against a tree at the edge of the lot, its surface cracked but still intact. My reflection was smiling. I don't know what to do anymore. Every time I try to run, it finds me. Every time I think I'm safe, it's there, watching, waiting. I've stopped looking in mirrors, stopped checking windows, puddles, anything that might show a reflection. But I can still feel it. It's not just in the mirrors anymore. It's in me. You never truly understand fear until it's inside you, whispering in your own voice, sharing your own thoughts. The thing in the mirror, the thing that wore my face, it wasn't just following me anymore. It was becoming me. Started small, like everything else. I catch myself doing things I didn't remember. Keys moved to the wrong place. Lights left on when I knew I'd turned them off. Once, I found myself standing in the middle of the kitchen, staring blankly at the fridge door. When I looked down, my hands were gripping a knife. I didn't remember picking it up. I began avoiding everyone. Friends, coworkers, even strangers on the street. I couldn't trust myself anymore. What if I wasn't me when they looked at me? What if they saw something else in my place? My isolation didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. The whispers grew louder, more persistent. They weren't just in my head. They were in my voice. At first, they said things I couldn't understand. Strange phrases that sounded like a foreign language. Then they started asking questions. Why do you run? Do you think you can escape? Do you know what you are? I stopped sleeping entirely. When I closed my eyes, I saw it. The house, the mirror, and the void. It felt like a tether pulling me back. A thread tying my soul to something I couldn't sever. Last night, it all came to a head. I was sitting in a cheap motel room, the last place I could think to go. The mirror in the bathroom was covered with a towel, every reflective surface in the room hidden or avoided. My phone was smashed to pieces after I'd caught my reflection smiling in the black screen. The air was thick, oppressive, and the room felt smaller than it had before. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. The whispers were back, filling the silence, louder than they'd ever been. Come home, they said. You belong with us. I gripped the edge of the bed, shaking, and screamed at the top of my lungs. What do you want from me? The room fell silent. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A crack. It ran along the wall like a jagged scar, spreading outward, the plaster crumbling as it grew. Something dark seeped from it, curling in the air like smoke. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as the crack widened, splitting the wall apart. On the other side was the basement. I don't remember crossing the threshold. One moment I was in the motel room, The next, I was back in the basement of that cursed house. The door to the mirror room was open, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. I tried to turn back, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was being dragged forward, each step slow and deliberate. The mirror was waiting. Its surface was pristine again, no sign of the cracks I'd made. The thing with my face stood on the other side, watching me with those hollow eyes. "You finally came back," it said, its voice a twisted echo of my own. I clenched my fists, shaking with anger and fear. "What do you want?" It smiled, stepping closer. "I don't want anything. You do. You've always wanted this." "Wanted what?" "To belong. To be free. To see what's behind the glass." I felt something pull at me, a force stronger than gravity. My reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and before I could react, its hand shot through, grabbing my wrist. The touch was ice cold, and my skin burned where it made contact. I tried to pull away, but it was too strong. "Let me go!" I screamed, thrashing against the pull. Tilted its head, its grin widening. "You still don't understand, do you? I am you, and you are me." The mirror pulled harder, and the world around me began to dissolve. The basement faded, replaced by the swirling void I'd seen before. Shadows moved in the darkness, countless figures watching silently. Then I felt it, a second hand. It wasn't pulling me, it was pushing me back. I fell hard onto the cold basement floor, gasping for air. The mirror was shattered again, its surface cracked and splintered. The thing was gone, its image replaced by 1,000 fractured versions of myself. The whispers were gone. The house was silent, but something was different. I stood, my legs shaky, and looked at the largest shard of glass. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. My eyes seemed darker, my smile slightly off, and then it spoke. "Don't worry," it said. "You're free now. I'll take care of everything." The shard fell from the wall, shattering into smaller pieces. When I looked down, the reflections were gone. I left the house that night, leaving everything behind. I never looked back. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I catch glimpses of myself in unexpected places. A car window, a puddle on the street. And I wonder, did I escape the house? Or did it escape with me?